Hello my people, welcome to my YouTube channel. In today's video, I'll be simplifying the return statement in JavaScript. So make yourself comfortable, relax, and enjoy the show. Next question you'll be asking, what is this return statement in functions? If you look at here, I have this simple function and it has this return statement in it. So return statement is kind of like it's just in a layman's understanding, it's just like a component in a function that determines what the function will produce when the function is being invoked. Okay, so in a simple term, what it means here, when I invoke this function, when I call this function here, I don't just have to call this function like the way we normally, let me comment this out. I don't just call this function this way. If I call this function like this and pass this those two arguments that is expected, let me say 2 and 7. If I pass this like this, or let me just make it 2 and 4. If I pass this way now, okay, look at this function now. It's returning this, is what it's saying here. It's saying a plus b. I'm returning this a plus b as a value when you invoke this function. So if I call this stuff like this function, if I call it like this and go to my browser where I'm running this code, you see that nothing happens here. We don't have access to it. We don't have access to it now. But if you want to get access to what is returning, you have to pass this function when you are calling it. Just like what I did, you have to pass it into a variable. You have to pass it into a variable. This is where you want to consider when you want to get that value. This value that this function is returning, when you want to get that value is returning, when you want to get it, you have to pass this. Remember the statement that said return. When this function is being invoked, return this. So it's returning this function, and whatever this a and b means is adding both of them, then return that result. This is what is up. So we now create a new variable called the result. Then now pass this stuff here you are seeing, as you call it, it returns a value. So I am taking whatever is returning here and pass it into this variable. So now when you consolidate this variable, you can now do whatever you want with it and have a say. Let's now consolidate this stuff here. Let's consolidate this result and see what you get. So if I come here now and consolidate, this is the key, then I put this result variable. I'll go back to my, if I go back to my browser here, look at it, the result is 8. Look at it, the result is 8 because it's saying here 5 plus 8. You get? So this is what is just happening here. It's just returning a value. This one, so we are actually using this return keyword there to return a value. When you invoke this function, it returns this value. And as well, there are also so let me give you a typical example. There are two things the return statement in JavaScript does. There are two major functions of it. Number one is returning a value. Number two is using it to exit a function, to terminate a function. Okay, so now I'll show you another example I'll show you another example, a use case of a return statement, how you can use it, where it's being used. So if I come here now, this is I'm just using this one now to return a value. Okay, let me show you another example. Okay, so just like I mentioned earlier, you can use it to also terminate a function, to exit a function. So look at this function now. What I'm doing is exiting a function prematurely. So now this is a function. This function said greet. This is a function called greet. So this function is expecting a parameter. It has one parameter a parameter called name. It's expecting this argument. Okay, so now when I call this function, look at at line 32, there's an if statement that said if this is falsy, we are negating this name here. If it's falsy, that means if it's falsy, if nothing is inside that name, it should exit this function by returning this string here that said please provide a name. So now let me call this function here. Let me show you something. I'm calling this function here and I'm passing nothing inside it. That means this name here is falsy. So now if I pass it into, if I consolidate this greet result, this variable, now let me put a key to it. I will call it, and now I will say, let me just remove this key. See, I think we will not need it. Let me just remove. So if I go to my browser now, remember I'm passing nothing inside this. This empty string is known as falsy as well. Okay, so I'm passing empty string here. Remember, this is different from null, but this one is called falsy. It's empty. Null is also falsy. So let me there's something called truth and falsy values in JavaScript. I will make a video about that in recent time. So in I think next week I'll make a video on it. So if I go to my browser, let me go back to my browser. I'll show you what's going to happen. If I reload my stuff here, look at it here. Provide please provide a name. And why did they return this stuff here? Because this is false. So it will terminate this function. This one now, this line 35 will not happen. That's what's happening. Once you terminate this function with this return statement here, this one now, the function will no longer continue. It will just exit the function. And that's just what's going to happen. So now, if this one, let me pass my name here. Let me write my name here and not pass it. I will say tempo. If I pass in tempo there and I call this function again, see what's going to happen. You see that hello tempo is saying hello tempo. So this one now, this function here now, this one now, the name here is truthing. So it will not exit it. It will not exit the function. The function will continue and run this line 35. So this is what return statement. In case you are trying to validate you are trying to validate some values, some variables in your function, the return keyword is very important. Okay, so now another thing I want to show you. Let me also give you another example. Let me show you another example. And as well, assuming I have a simple function. Let's say let me remove this stuff here. Let me just cut this off. And I have this function here. Let's say return. I'm saying this function should return this name here. It will still work as the same thing. Look at it. It will work the same way. But I want to show you something. If I come here and say something like log, and I want to log something here and say this is tempo. Are you seeing that this thing ordinarily this console here looks like deactivated stuff? It looks like it's not active. You are seeing the color has changed because once after this return statement, anything under this return statement will no longer happen. You see, unreachable code detected. That's what VS Code is telling you. Once this return statement happens, return keyword happens, any other code under it will no longer run. Once this return keyword runs, any other code under it will not run. You have to be very careful when you are using the return statement. This is mostly for beginners. You have to be very careful with the return statement. And as well, and I'll also show you when the return statement return undefined. Let me undo this stuff here. So just like I mentioned now, this one now will return undefined. This is when it's returning undefined. If you call this function here now, look at this function. This function is called do something. If I call it here and pass it into a variable and try to console log this, you see that it's going to return nothing. It's returning nothing, so it's going to return undefined for because this function is doing nothing. It's doing nothing actually. So if I come here again now, look at it here. The result here is undefined because it's returning nothing. Is returning nothing and it's just returning nothing inside it. So it will return undefined. Okay. So let me also show you. So if I call this function here and I'm passing this 2 into it, so I'm trying to check if this number, this parameter, if it's greater than I'm trying to return a boolean value. If it's greater than 0, I will return true. If it's less than 0, I will return what? False. So here, and if I come here now, if I come here and go back to my browser now, you see that it's returning true. The result here is true. And if I try to make this one to be, let me put it -1 is less than 0 here, and if I go back there, you see that it's going to return false. Look at it. So here now, let me come back again. I'll show you another example that you need to see. So in this case now, I'm trying to create a function that will return another function, which is what we call the closure. So when you embed a function into another function, and that function returns another function, that's what we call the closure. I'll also make a separate video on closure to explain it very well. So if you look at this now, you see that this function is returning this function. This line 130 here is returning another function, and this function will now check and say x multiply this factor. It returns another function, and this factor here, this factor parameter is coming from the first function called the create multiplier. So what this closure does is that this closure has access to the other functions variables. Okay, so even if you define function here, but I'm not talking about closure. Let me just talk about the return. So what this function is doing that is returning another function, and that function that is returning is what we call the closure. So if I call this function to get access to this function, I'll need to do something like, let's say like we are calling this, we have to call this function 2 times. Like you call this function, it will return this function, then you call this function, this inside function, you now return it again to call this one. That to get this result, you need to call this function. Whatever this, when you call this create multiply function, whatever it returns, which is what will have passed into this variable called double. Then you call this double again to get access to this. So this is what the return. If you look at, we have two return keywords. So if I call this function here, look at this line 135. I'm calling this function here now, pass 2 into it, which is the factor. It will return this. Remember, I'm trying to use the return keyword to return a function. So now it will return this function. This double is a function because this create multiply is returning the function. So now this function, I'll call it again. I'll pass. Remember, it's also expecting an argument. It's expecting an argument. So I'll pass in this argument 5 inside this one now, and this one I will now return this x multiplied by factor, x times factor. That means this x is this 5, and this factor here is the 2. So it will not be 5 times what? 2. So let's console log it and see what you have. Look at, we have 10. You see, we have 10. So this is the close. Now let's also talk about how to use it to return object and array. So if I come here now, you see that this one now, I'm trying to create a person. So this is expecting two parameters, name and argument. So now if I call, I'm trying to return this. This is the object I'm returning. I'm just returning this object. So when you call this function, it returns this object. You pass it into this variable called name. You see that this name now, this is Alice, the age is 30. These are the argument, and this is the parameter. So now if I come back here again and see, let me reload this stuff. Did I save? And I'll say create this person, blah 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 blah. Create person, pass it into this, and console log it. Let me see. Is there any challenge? Look at it. It's returning that person. It's returning this function, this object. You see. So now let's also see in the case of array. So here now, if you look at it, I'm trying to filter out. I'm trying to use this array to filter out numbers that are even number. Okay. So, and how do you get the even number? Even number, when you divide them, there is a zero reminder. Okay. So now, if I call this is a function called filter even numbers, I'll just pass in this numbers. This number is an array, and I'll do dot filter on top of it and say this number. Remember, this number will represent each of these each of the items in this array. Now, now say if each of these, if the modulus 2 is equals to 0, that is the remainder. When you divide this with 2, the remainder is equals to 0. That's what we know as the even number. So it returns a new array that contains only number that passes this test. Okay, so now if I come here now, this is just a variable called number, and it's an array, and I'll call this function and pass it into it. You see that it will return this new, this is a new array. Let me also go to my browser again. You see, it's returning a new array 6, 4, 10, 32, 30, 42. These are the even numbers. You see that here is omitting 7, is omitting 5, and is omitting 11, because that when you the remainder is not 0. Okay, let's continue. So in this example, I'm trying to use the return keyword to stop a function. This one will help us to stop a function. So now what I'm trying to check now, this is a function called process number. This process number, I'm calling it here, and I'm passing an argument of 5 into it. So what I'm trying to check here from line 2, I'm saying the type of number, which is this variable, which is this parameter, if the type is not equals to number. Remember, I have the JavaScript data types. I'm checking if it's not a number. I'll just console log input is not a valid number. Okay, but if it's a number, it will run, the code will continue to run. If this statement is true, if this evaluate as truth, it will terminate this function, and it will first of all log this, then terminate this function. What it means that this part of the code will not continue. So now if you look at this, now I'm passing a number, and this is the number. You see that this stuff here will not happen. This block of code here will not happen. This if statement will not happen. Then it will jump this, come here, run this code here, this algorithm, then console log the result. So let's go to my browser and show you the response. You see that the result is what, 10, because we are passing in a number. So if I try to pass in something like, let me pass in a string called tempo. So I'm trying to pass in a string called tempo. So now if I come here, as I pass in this a string called tempo, you will see that if I go back to my browser, you see input is not a valid number. it will just console log this stuff here. You can as well put a code that will run here. Either if you are using, if you are writing an API, a backend code, you can just return to the you can send the response to the client and say the parameter, maybe payload or the ID or whatever they are receiving is invalid, or anything you want to do with it. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here is, once this parameter here is not a number type, I will console log this and terminate this code. This code will stop here. It will stop here and this place will not run. So if you look at it here, you see that this part of the code is not running. It's not console logging this response. If you look at it again, you see it will just give us this first console and terminate the function. So guys, this is a very quick explanation of return statements in JavaScript and some of the use cases. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you benefit anything from this tutorial, please hit the subscribe button. This is just a very easy way to appreciate what I'm doing and encourage my channel. Thank you guys.